Some 3/4 of all historic dates found in any modern history textbook are based on a supposedly ancient book called FCB Pamphili. Since this ancient work was most important for the timings of all historical events, that is why the father of the fabricated history, Scaliger, took to the task himself. The mainstream history assures us that after Scaliger made a copy of this very ancient manuscript, the original disappeared. Our history, the way we know it, is mostly based on this book. The rest of so-called ancient sources are the books that were copied by the monks, but not just any monks, just few very selected and small groups. But to replace the entire history of entire planet is not that easy. Okay, they created the new version, but the real records, the real old books and the memory of the people still kept the real history that needed to be destroyed. That is why, under the false flag of religious slogans, lists of banned books were created. Most of the books, all books, not just religious books, were in these lists. Very few of the truly old books were not enlisted. Basically, everything that was old needed to be burned and destroyed completely. If one book of a given author belonged to a banned list, that meant automatically, by law, that all of the other books of this particular author were banned as well and must be given by the citizens for burning. Otherwise, the citizens would be burned themselves. And along with the books, very often in the fires would end up the authors of the books as well. The clergy appointed numerous and very strict commissions that would keep a very close eye and actually had absolute control on what could be printed and what could be not, and who possesses what kind of books at home.
Military-style searches were conducted at various suspect locations, both private and public.
All borders were under very strict control for banned books. However, controlling the maps that the sailors use was a bit more difficult for obvious reasons. That is why now and then uncomfortable ancient maps surface. As of today, there is no scientific collection published that contains all old maps. One must work hard to find different fragments here and there, and in most cases the maps are published in very low resolution so that one cannot read the small details, and also that makes it harder to notice the places where the map has been edited in recent times. And even after all that, there were people who were skeptical about the new history and didn't want to accept it. That is why the Holy Inquisition always had fires ready at hand to burn those who did not agree. This is how our so-called history was made official, not by scientists and not by historians. In more ancient time, the forces of evil, the parasitic forces, fought humanity openly, and everybody knew who fights whom. In more recent times, they completely changed their tactics. Now they don't show their faces openly, and they only operate through a relatively small number of humans who know everything and are members of the top levels of various secret societies. The rest of the population of the earth has been rendered so senseless and so unaware of its real nature and history as a result of the fraudulent propaganda of the parasites, which has been reshaping our views for many centuries, that most of us have become not people but sheeple, blindly following our so-called elected leaders. Although social surveys from all over the world all point to the fact that most of the people on this planet consider their government leaders to be total scam and fraud and criminals, still those very same people watch TV every day, TV which is censored by that same honest government. And these very same people believe the school books, although these school books have been instituted as true by that same government. The social institution of a country or a state developed at this point of time when the parasites managed to convince certain group of people to go against their own brothers. Then the need appeared for those groups to fence up parts of the earth as their own and call them states and countries. All this is described in the Vedas as the beginning of the dark ages of Kali Yuga. Before that, there were only provinces of the great empire of the survivors. And even that so-called empire was not an empire the way we imagine it nowadays. It was not a country that kept its citizens like slaves, like the modern countries. People were free and they owned the land they were born on. Finally, sometimes in the 16th and 17th century, the parasites managed to corrupt a group of the humans on the territory of Western Europe, and those started carrying out their plan of creating countries and states that were absolutely independent from territories that abided the law of goodness, the laws brought to them by the survivors or those educated by them directly or not. The parasites managed to appoint their own people, which were rebels and insurgent kings, who manipulated the public opinion with lies and false religion-based slogans. According to the law of that time, kings who did not have proper right to the throne, who were insurgents, they had to be punished by death. That is why these newly appointed rulers desperately needed a new history that will make their claim to the throne seem legitimate. All this was centrally orchestrated by the parasites, and that is why a very similar scenario happened almost in each and every European country. And that is when Scaliger was ordered to create a new history that would be convenient to the insurgent rulers, who in exchange for being placed on the throne by fraud, vowed in loyalty to the dark forces, who eventually would carry through them warfare against the citizens of these countries. The newly fabricated history at that time was very close and similar to the real events that happened. However, the empire of the survivors and their glorious past was absolutely excluded from this history. Not only the memory of the empire was completely erased, but events that, although distorted, were still connected to it, were artificially, fraudulently sent away to the faraway past, and thus made look even more unimportant and irrelevant to the new historic reality that was imposed upon the people somewhere in the 16th and 17th century. The Society of the Flemish Jesuits issued 53 thick volumes with so-called ancient books that conveniently disappeared in various library fires after the copies of them were made by these Jesuits. Another big center of the so-called copy-making was the order of the Benedict monks. It is a well-known fact mentioned in those thick volumes themselves and accepted by mainstream historians that the monks were not merely making copies. They honestly confessed, "We are also correcting the books so that they will fit the new ideas of the 17th century." And actually that is one of the best scenarios. In some cases there was no ancient text at all, and compositions that were written in 16th and 17th century are now quoted as ancient works. A huge collection of so-called ancient books whose originals conveniently and selectively burned in library fires was published by these Benedict monks, and this collection contained 221 volumes of Latin works supposedly belonging to ancient Romans,
and not to mention 161 volumes supposedly written by ancient Greek authors.
If you think that all monks of that time were innocent, godly creatures who could not be susceptible to any corruption, please follow the links about the monks in the description of this video. I promise you will not regret. Let's get into the details of how the history of a full planet was shifted, for example, with 1,000 years back in time. In the Middle Ages, people used to write years in a different way, not the way we write them now. There were two ways in the Middle Ages to write the name of our Savior, Jesus Christ. One was Jesus, and the other one was Christos. And when people meant that a certain event happened 300 years after Jesus Christ, they placed an I in front of the number of the year. An alternative version was to place the letter X, and that originated from the name Christos, because that is how, till nowadays, the Slavic people call our Savior Jesus Christ. For example, Ludovici Elsevier is considered by the mainstream historians to be a Renaissance publisher. However, as we can see on their own emblem, the year is 595. Before this year, we see the letter I and a dot after it. This is obviously not the number 1. Another example, according to the mainstream history, this is 1521. However, if you pay attention, this is clearly the letter I. This is not the number 1, and it is separated with dots. Another example, this is interpreted nowadays as year 1656. However, we can see that it actually has the letter I instead of 1, and the year written is 656.
There were different handwriting styles for writing the letter I. Here is another one from Germany. This is year 658. However, nowadays it is interpreted as 1658.
This is from Nuremberg, Germany, and again, there is no doubt that this is year 699. and there is a letter I in front of it. This is not the number 1. 1 was never written in this way. While the previous writing was before the introduction of the ideas of Scaliger, this is the same location, but the paintings are from the 18th century. And here we see how the letter I has been substituted with the number 1, and in this way the history was prolonged with 1000 years. There are endless examples that this is not 1, it is the letter I. In some cases, the letter I, or in Slavic the letter X, was completely omitted. Like for example, on this map, the cartographer absolutely clearly writes that this is something referring to year 740 and 750, and yet the mainstream historians conveniently place it in year 1740 and 1750. And this is not the only such example. An old emblem of the city of Vilnius. It is absolutely clearly written on it, 7th century. And yet according to the mainstream history, this is city of the Middle Ages.
Thousands of stone monuments are found on the Balkan Peninsula. They are called steci. Often they are classified as mysterious. That is a graceful prelude, hinting that they would not be included in the history. And why should they? They have some sort of dates written on them, and they don't fit in any calendar.
Or at least any calendar that normal mortals like ourselves are supposed to inquire into.
And it seems the calendar used had a record of 7,000 years. That number will come up again when we discuss the Book of Veles, which seems to be an authentic, very old book that survived the medieval burning. A book which provides some details about the advanced cultures as far as 7 or even 20,000 years ago. But although the Book of Veles is included in the curriculum of some of the courses offered by certain European universities, still we're very far from replacing the Scaligerian fantasies taught in schools with something that has much greater chances to be the truth, like the Book of Veles. Still, children in school are left with the impression that 7 or 20,000 years ago, the most sophisticated idea that the man could come up with is chasing a wild hog with a stick. Here is a decree from Copenhagen. At the time when the new calendar was introduced, people were simply obliged to stick to it. They were threatened with heavy fines in case they tried to use the old calendar. In his books, Anatoly Fomenko provides examples that similar decrees were issued so that the local names of various villages, towns and areas are changed. Because once the actual historic name of a given place is erased, is lost, then even if somebody finds a true historic record in the future,
they won't be able to figure out where did the given event take place.
Similar decrees were issued also about certain historic events.
Whenever
something happened that was very uncomfortable for the history fabricators and people saw it, there was a decree, a law that told people that actually something else happened, and if you talk about what you saw, then, of course, the heaviest punishment.
At this point, you probably wonder, but how did it work in reality? How did the common people, for example, in year 600 after Christ, all of a sudden start thinking that it is now 1600 after Christ. Actually, the common people didn't even understand what happened because, conveniently, exactly at that time, the calendar was changed. The new Gregorian calendar was introduced and everything was set to the so-called correct dates, and because it was all done centrally on paper, the common people on the street did not understand what's going on at all. In this way, the history the way you know it appeared. It was not created by historians, but by illusionists, trickster, circus-style magicians. However, there were educated people as well, and they figured out the scam. One of them is the famous physicist Isaac Newton. Somehow they conveniently miss to tell us that he was a chronologist as well. He was persistently arguing that the history of the kingdoms of Egypt has been artificially sent to past with 1800 years. The history of ancient Greece sent artificially back to the past with 534 years, and the history of the Roman culture sent back in time artificially with about 1000 years. Those who are further interested can find more detail in his book Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended. John Hardwin was one of the most educated men of his time, and he also argued against the validity of this Caligari history. He was a royal librarian, and he found out that this Caligari history was founded on books that are not genuine. Actually, the list of scholars who doubted the genuineness of the theory of Caligari is very, very long and continues to get longer nowadays very quickly. I have included it for your reference in the description of this video, and I would highly recommend that you have a look at it. There are many contemporary scholars listed that also maintain their websites. Some of them could be in your native language. But the 1000 years shift back in history was not the only shift. Actually, it was one out of the many. Local regional shifts of the histories of individual countries were also needed, and it all depended on what kind of forgery they can do to misplace the particular regional events, in a way that people will naively believe it. Let's see one example. This is a document by the famous writer Lermontov. It is used as a proof for dating historic events. It is shown in the textbooks a very low resolution. There are dates indeed on this document, and it is actually an authentic document with the authentic writing of the famous author. However, if you pay a close attention to the numbers used to write the years, you will notice something strange. The number 3 is very unusual in both cases. If we see other documents of Lermontov, we can notice that he writes 3 in a completely different manner. It is becoming pretty obvious that the 7 has been made artificially to look like 3, and in this way a given historical event has been sent back in time with 40 years. This is how our so-called history was fabricated. Sending events back in time is extremely convenient for the parasites. It creates the illusion that things have always been like this. It creates the feeling of helplessness in the common people. They feel that they are being oppressed and manipulated. However, the authority of the parasites, represented by our rulers, so-called elected rulers, seems strong and long established. Not only the bloody parasitic phase in our history seems stronger and longer, but also the times when people were actually free seem even more distant and more elusive, as if they never existed. I have traveled a lot in my life, and in all countries, people are not happy with their rulers. They do not feel that the presidents and the governments are representing their real will. And yet they feel powerless to do anything because they think that it has always been like this. One of the main purposes of this video is to make known to people, no, it was not like this always. And the times when we were free are much, much closer than everybody would expect. Mainstream history assures us that the states or countries or empires appeared naturally within the human society and were sign of their sophistication and so-called advancement. While in reality, these are nothing else but devious, evil institutions created by the parasites with the sole purpose of organizing suicidal wars amongst people.
For example, scientists, Americanologists like Leonard Adam, Carl Gensi, Paul Rivet, Jose Imbellione, and many others, studied the Asian American parallels in art. They observed clear similarities in the motifs, ornaments, and stylized design of cultural artifacts between East Asia on one hand and the northwest coast of America and Mexico on the other.
The similarities between the styles were too close for them to develop independently, just like that by chance.
Later on, German and Austrian anthropologists who created the theory of the Kulturkreis, or culture circle or cultural field, people like Grabner, Schmidt, Ankerman, Cooper, and others
tried to prove that the cultures of all the nations around the globe originated from 7 or 8 successive waves of migration of a gigantic scale emanating from a certain mysterious center which should be located somewhere in Europe or Asia.
And these anthropologists concluded, unfortunately, nearly all of the parallels that we presented are of no use, as the chronological gap between them spans over many centuries. If, let's say, the lotus pattern from Amaravati, India, date to the 2nd century BC, their Mexican doubles from Chichen Itza were created somewhere around in the 12th century AD. In Cambodia, the step pyramid design appeared for the first time only in the 10th century AD, whereas in Mesoamerica that happened in the early 1st century BC.
And it was only the mistaken Scaliger chronology which hindered these historians. Their observations about the cultural items were absolutely correct. However, they did not fit in the mistaken official chronology.